Dr. Basiago, and this is the Quest for Truth.
And my name is Aaron Moriarity, your moderator, and here we are again on the 7th. Welcome back, Andy. Everyone's waiting to hear from you.
Good to be back, my friend. How are you?
Well, if I was doing any better, I'd be you. So there you go.
Right.
Oh, always true. So, no, today I understand you want to talk about the 8 different modalities of time travel that was developed by DARPA through Project Pegasus. Is that right?
Right. Project Pegasus was what was known as a classified defense-related research and development program. So when I entered in fall of 1969, these methodologies and devices had already been developed. One of the principal reasons that children were used in Project Pegasus is that DARPA was testing our responses to these forms of quantum access. Because bear in mind, we've been using the phrase time travel, but better to use the phrase, I think, quantum access, because some of it was travel in time, some of it was seeing in time, and as we'll find tonight, some of it was just guided psychic performance. So I think quantum access really encapsulates the entire field a little bit more accurately. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, Aaron, why did I ask to do this tonight? Well, let me explain. I've been speaking out about Project Pegasus for almost 20 years. I have been featured on television shows originating in 6 countries, on radio shows originating in 15 countries, and I've lectured throughout the Western Hemisphere about my experiences in Project Pegasus, from Kelowna, British Columbia in the north, to Capella del Monte, Argentina in the south, and from Orlando, Florida in the east to Kona, Hawaii in the west. And despite that sort of full spectrum approach to media, as I refer to it, I still receive calls and emails via Facebook and so forth every day, believing that I've been talking about one technology, which has been teleportation, which I think is the measure of public fascination in what I have had to say about the Tesla teleportation that was one of the 8 modalities that Project Pegasus was working with. But it was by no means all we were doing in the program. So I thought it would be beneficial if I could go back again and describe those 8 modalities of quantum access, of time travel, if you will, that they were bringing us through in kind of a set of more and more sort of substantial and quite frankly trying experiences during those 4 years that I was in Project Pegasus.
Wow, that's I know your story pretty well, Andy, but one of the modalities that you've talked about, it's probably not going to be the first one you talk about, but the one that always fascinates me because it seems doable for the average person is the spinning out of your body.
Right. Well, that's number 2.
Okay, that's number 2.
And by the way, I was going to mention that there was a publicist for the Beatles who said that one can be a warning or an inspiration. And I was really speaking out about these entire 8 modalities to try to be bold. I was trying to inspire to bring about something that my late father certainly wanted, which was to implement global public teleportation. And I wanted to warn everybody about the advent of chronovision, because they needed to know that everything they did was being stored in the quantum hologram and would ultimately be recoverable via chronovision. So I was really trying to be both an inspiration and a warning. And I hope I have been. But I still think there's a lot of confusion as to what Project Pegasus was, because I every day I get an inquiry and somebody says, well, tell me about this teleportation thing that made up Project Pegasus. And I would go, au contraire, it was 1 out of 8 things we were doing. So the spinning to induce out-of-body experiences, Aaron, that was actually the second thing I was going to mention tonight. The first thing they involved us in was, in fact, remote viewing.
Okay.
Now, what is remote viewing? Remote viewing, whether you are seeing things in real time at a distance or seeing things with an adjustment into what we call the past or the future with some displacement of space, is psychical time travel, if you will. Now, that was what they started us doing. I've said how all of the children who were ultimately used in time travel by DARPA's Project Pegasus were originally remote viewers used by the Office of Naval Intelligence. We were small mediums at large. So one of the things they had us do was they showed us the Annapolis graduation photograph, the ensign photograph of Lieutenant Commander John McCain. And they said, bad people are keeping this young man, John, somewhere in the world. Here's one of the buildings they may be keeping him in. And then without telling us he was a Navy flyer who had been downed in Vietnam and was being kept as a prisoner of war at the Hanoi Hilton, they showed us one of the buildings at the Hanoi Hilton. And they said, we want you to go home and dream about where John is, being held by bad people somewhere in the world. And is he in this building? And if so, where is he in this building? So I went home and I dreamt about John McCain maybe 4 or 5 times in the intervening week between the next, Tuesday at 10 a.m. meeting with this lieutenant commander from the Office of Naval Intelligence. I saw him being frog-marched down a narrow hallway illuminated only by bare bulbs. I saw him being crammed into a tiger cage on the side of that hallway. I saw him being suspended by his elbows from the ceiling until he passed out. And I knew that the North Vietnamese, who I realized were the ones keeping John, were keeping him in an earthen hallway that they had dug under the building. So the next Tuesday at 10 a.m., when we were questioned about that particular session of remote viewing by this lieutenant commander for the Office of Naval Intelligence, in full dress white uniform, who came to our school, I and one of the little girls in the program, about maybe about 12 kids there, 6 from my school and 3 from Cedar Knolls Elementary and 3 from Salem Drive Elementary, we're just sort of like jumping out of our seats, trying to speak first to tell the LCDR for the ONI what we had seen when we were sleeping and our mind could relax and go to where John was being kept by bad people somewhere in the world. Now, when Senator McCain went through Oregon in his 2008 race for the Republican nomination, I contacted Oregonians for McCain and told him my story and said, sir, I don't even know if Senator McCain knows that his late father, John Sidney McCain Sr., who was then the director of the commander of the entire Pacific Fleet of the U.S. Navy, whether Senator McCain knows that his father was commissioning child psychics in New Jersey to use their psychic ability to go where he was in captivity and inform them whether he was in the Hanoi Hilton, and if so, where in one of those distinctive buildings there. But I'm a member of the Washington Bar in private practice, member in good standing. You can check that with the Washington State Bar Association in Seattle. And I'd love to meet Senator McCain and tell him about what I saw. and just let him know that that was one of the things that was done for him by his late father to try to rescue him. I guess to, blow up those buildings at the Hanoi Hilton to either kill high-profile POWs like Senator McCain undoubtedly was because of his father's status as the commander of the entire Pacific Fleet of the U.S. Navy, or maybe to breach the POW compound and rescue him. We weren't told such details, but Senator McCain, bless his memory, refused to meet with me. And I said, well, I can send him a letter about what happened. And I just never got around to it because I was focused on my own legal career and then by 2016, my own presidential race. But I did make a valiant effort to let this American senator know what had been done for him in the area of not just of remote viewing, but child psychics performing remote viewing. And by the way, note how this was in fall of 1969. So I contextualize the fact that the often repeated claim that remote viewing began in 1972 at SRI, that's Stanford Research Institute, which was often claimed by remote viewing pioneers like Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff and Ingo Swann, was not true. The Navy was using children in remote viewing 3 years earlier, and I have no evidence we were the first. When I discuss some of these things tonight, I'll explain why I believe they were working in these modalities for quite a while before we were involved in them. But that was number one, was psychical time travel via remote viewing, and that allowed us to sort of go beyond the ordinary and see things. So that was sort of the initial training in the more far out modalities of time travel that would follow in the next 3 years.
Wow. Wow, that's fascinating. So a whole bunch of you did that. And of course, you only know what you found out. So that's interesting. So number two is the spinning. Now, after you told me about that, I'm thinking maybe I should rig up something where I could spin myself out of my body, but then who would be turning it off so I could come back? I don't know. Maybe it won't work. Maybe I shouldn't do that. So,
right. The second modality clearly was spinning to induce out-of-body experiences. Now, how did they do that spinning? They basically placed us on our backs on a tabletop-like device. Our heads were spinning in the center of the spinning. In other words, our legs were going around the periphery. We were looking up at a Twilight Zone-like spiral image taped on a poster to the ceiling. Now, what's interesting about that is I know that there was faded, remember that old cellophane tape of that era that would kind of fade in the sun?
Yeah, turn yellow.
So you'd have a piece of paper that the tape had been placed on and would get kind of yellowed.
Yep.
It was like early Scotch tape. I think it was called cellophane.
Right.
And so the Twilight Zone image that was taped to the ceiling that we were trained to sort of look at and let our eyes go relax as we were being spun was an old poster. So we were by no means the first American school children who were spun to induce out-of-body experiences.
Wow.
But what they trained us to do was to just relax our eyes. And what you would happen would be, you would see this Twilight Zone spiral spinning above you, and you would kind of black out, and you would feel like your body was sinking. And then it would pop out of the body, and your spirit would go up, and up and up and up, and even through the ceiling of the school. And then I would be traveling along a plane. Everything above me was moving forward at a fast rate. Everything below me was moving behind me at a fast rate. And at one point, I reached this it's really hard to describe. It was like it looked almost like a black railway bridge of that, of earlier times in this country. And I couldn't get past it. And then I came back to my body, and I was interviewed by a local health teacher, and I have her name. In fact, she became my health teacher in the 6th grade at Memorial Middle School in Whippany, New Jersey. Her name was Stephanie Bindis, Bindas. Mrs. Bindis has had a scholarship named for her by the Hanover Township School District. And I was lecturing in Orlando, Florida for the New Consciousness Expo in August of 2017. And some native New Jerseyites, or New Jerseyans as they're called, were hosting that incredible conference. I remember that Nick Begich Jr. was one of the speakers there, as was Dr. Joel Wallach. And they had located the Stephanie Bindis Scholarship Program of the Hanover Township School District. So anyway, Mrs. Bindis interviewed me. She said, okay, and she got as they always did, freshly sharpened pencil, a legal notepad, and said, okay, Andy, tell me what you saw. And I described for her what I just described to you, which is this sort of black railroad bridge type object that I just couldn't get past. And she said, this is a direct quote, she said, yes, others who we've spun to reduce out-of-body experiences are describing that. We think it's the infrastructure generating the hologram in which we find ourselves. We're calling it the Matrix.
Wow.
Now, Aaron, that discussion was held in 1970.
Wow.
Which was 29 years before the Wachowski brothers did their film, The Matrix.
Right.
Based on that original screenplay, The Third Eye, by that woman, I think her name was Stephanie Stewart. So I can't think of any better example of the fact that the terms of art that we're developing in these classified defense-related research and development programs, like DARPA's Project Pegasus, which I was in, we're taking those terms of art and then dropping them in to feature films, TV shows, specials on television, documentaries, books, comic books, etc. They were sort of using science fiction to be able to point to science fiction and say, oh no, we're not working on that. You were just inspired by that science fiction featured film or TV show that you saw, or book that you read. Now, we know that science fiction was a literary genre invented as propaganda by the Defense Department of the West. The American, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, so-called UK, USA network. Because we know, for example, that, who was it? It was Arthur C. Clarke and Robert A. Heinlein, who had desks next to each other at British intelligence during World War II. So here's a perfect example of the way in which science fiction was used to disguise science fact. And that was their discovery by 1970, that we possess, as I discussed during a previous show, they knew that we possess a spirit that does not die, but we are that spirit is incarnated in a body inside a hologram that's being generated by a machine. And I'm sorry if that burst some people's bubbles, but that is the way that reality is actually ordered. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't share that fact with others.
Wow. Wow, I know. When they spun you, I mean, did you have to drink something, or did you have to get a shot or something, or was there any kind of...
No, occasionally a child would ask to be let off the table and would throw up. I mean, because it was...
Yeah.
rather nauseating sometimes. One time, I resisted the relaxation, and I started yelling, "Slow it down, slow it down, slow it down," because it was just utterly deracinating to be spun with your head towards the center and then resist the spinning. That was very disorienting and uncomfortable.
Wow.
But that only happened once. I usually just relaxed and went with the spinning, and it was quite easy for me to leave my body. And then as a result of that, I would be dreaming at night, and I would leave my body and just float around the house and the neighborhood, and it sort of reminded me that my spirit was independent of my body, and it gave me the ability to leave my body, to have an out-of-body experience almost at will.
Wow.
I had that a number of times. So I think that, in a sense, Project Pegasus, as represented by the fact that they were teaching us the Astart alphabet for alien-human communication, and I mentioned the triple entendre involved in that. It was a start in sort of logical thinking as a form of mathematical logic code notation, as I once saw it identified in an encyclopedia. It was Ast Art, or star art, and it was a reference to Astarte, the goddess of the Egyptian mystery school. So by involving little kids in things like remote viewing and then spinning to induce out-of-body experiences, they were enabling us basically to have OBEs without being spun. Now, interestingly, I received a phone call from an individual named Tamela D'Amico, who stated that she was had been a young actress in Hollywood about 20 years earlier, and was in a car accident on the way home where her car was spun. And the paramedics got her out of her car, and she walked over to a woman's apartment that was right near the accident scene. And the woman let her come in and call her boyfriend to tell her boyfriend about the accident. And she said the woman was dressed in a tie-dye shirt and sandals and a weird kind of dress like from the 1960s. And that when she went back to that woman's apartment a few days later to buy her some to bring her some flowers and candy or something, the manager of that apartment complex said, "Man, there's no way any woman could have helped you who lived in this apartment, because we've used this for storage for 30 years. And he opened it up, and it was all crammed with boxes and old refrigerators and TV shows and stuff. So what apparently happened to this young actress is that she went back in time as a result of being spun in that accident. I also found a reference by the prominent Canadian physicist Wilbur Smith that spinning is a way to induce time travel. So I think that we have to identify the fact that, yes, we were going OBE, but we were going on a form of sort of astral time travel that probably was quantum related, not just an out-of-body experience, as it were. I do remember one time I was going towards that infrastructure thing that we were calling the Matrix, and I saw these adults on my left going up and to the left like they were going back to heaven. It was like a group of people who were killed in a car accident, a group of adults, and they were just sort of laughing that they were out of their bodies and going back to heaven. So that was quite strange, but we did quite a number of those. Beginning in, I have it in my book, I've dated all these, so I'd have to do some more memory work, but I think it was spring of 1969 when they started the remote viewing in fall of 69, and I think they were spinning us to induce the out-of-body experiences in fall of 69. There was quite a lot of that, and it became something I could do almost at will.
Wow.
Can't do it now.
No?
Certainly during moments of pain, I've gone out of my body. But that's just thing that happens to everybody.
Boy, I've only been out of my body once, and I don't want to do it again.
Yeah.
But it was it changed my life for sure. So it definitely does prove to you that there is something beyond the body that is us, the true us. And
well, the way I see it is the brain controls the body and the mind controls the spirit.
Right.
Now, I just want to make that sort of a bench note about this issue. Everybody's calling the spirit the soul. That is not accurate. It's a major error in the paranormal and even in philosophy and epistemology. A soul is an embodied spirit. So all of us are souls. So if we've been on the Titanic, right, X number of souls were lost on deck during the Titanic sinking. Mm-hmm. A soul is a spirit in a bodily form. But the spirit is what has been called sort of the phantom captain. The spirit is the weightless, invisible, eternal occupant of the body. When that spirit is occupying the body, those two things make up a soul. Okay, and we've been calling the spirit the soul.
Okay.
Even Gary Zukav did that book, The Soul Knows. But that was a misnomer. That should have been entitled The Spirit Knows.
Now, I
just thought I'd mention that in light of the fact that that's essentially what spinning was doing. It was causing an out-of-body experience. What? By the soul? No, by the spirit. Because the spirit out of the body is not a soul. It's a spirit. You have to be in the body to be a soul.
I've heard it talked about as an immortal spiritual being that's inside us, that we are.
Yeah, well, it's not immortal. Immortal means doesn't die. We do die.
No. Our spirit goes on.
We have an eternal spirit.
Right.
We go from
that's what
life
I'm talking about.
to life as an eternal spirit.
Right.
Unfortunately, experiencing the mortality of our bodies and pain, suffering, death, and the mortality of the body, but not our spirit, until we reach ascension. And then we have a weightless, transparent, real but non-physical body that does not die and does not get sick.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Or experience any disability or pain. So that's something I wanted to share tonight, which I hope people see is very hopeful. Life is meaningful. Life is going somewhere, and where it's going is ascension. The goal of us, until we get there, is to be more Christian, to learn to love and just to learn, but in the process, become more like Jesus, become more Christian. What did he say? Follow after me, and you will become like me. Okay, so we are developing our spirits so that when our spirits are out of our body, they're no longer a soul for that lifetime. They've gone back to the Godhead, also called heaven or nirvana, and then we come back again into what we call reincarnation. It's actually incarnation. Mm-hmm. It's basically investiture in a new body and a new identity.
Right.
And that is the path to ascension.
Awesome. Wow. Now you're giving these, you've given two so far, remote viewing and spinning. Are you giving these in the order that you actually experienced them in?
I'm giving them in the order they were introduced.
Okay, awesome. That makes a lot of sense that they would do it this way. Very, very good.
Right.
So what's...
Right, the third, of course, was the Montauk Chair. Now, was it called the Montauk Chair? No. When were we first placed in this chair? Probably, I guess it was like beginning in fall of 1970. By the way, I did all the memory work on these dates, and they're already in my books. I'm just kind of trying to place all the dates correctly. That's somewhat of a major effort now that I've lost my vision. But the third was the Montauk Chair. It was definitely the Montauk Chair because it was doing exactly what the Project Montauk experts like Preston Nichols and Peter Moon have discussed. It was not called the Montauk Chair because, wait a minute, Project Montauk was not launched until 1983, and we were using this chair 13 years earlier. Now, what would happen is a young man named David, it may have been the man who would later be known to everyone as Dr. David Lewis Anderson, but a young postdoc named David would come to the learning lab at my school. It was an art lab that they were using to train us for Project Pegasus, and he would set up what we now call the Montauk Chair. It was basically like a chaise lounge that you would sit in. There was like a solenoid behind your solar plexus on the back of the chair. There was sort of a cathode ray tube on a fishhook-like device at your feet that would be directed at your face, and then there was like a photographer's umbrella above your head on the chair. And they would turn the chair on, and you would experience kind of a buzzing sensation. And you would sort of black out, and your body would drop again, just like when you were being spun, and then it would go up and bounce out of your body, and then start moving forward in time-space, feet first. But if I looked with my eyes, it was kind of like doing the luge in the Olympics. We were, racing forward feet first. And then we would get to this black, shiny plane, and we would see something on the horizon, and then, bam, once we saw it, we would collide with that object on the horizon. And we were in a subjective moment of our own futures. And we would spend about 15 or 20 minutes there, and then ask somebody there, or just lay down and start sleeping. And then we would wake up back in the chair, back in Morris Plains, New Jersey, 1970. So now, interestingly, Dr. David Lewis Anderson went on Coast to Coast AM when I believe when Art Bell was still the host in 2002, and said that in 1970, the Montauk Chair went national and involved thousands of American school children in visits to moments of their own subjective futures.
Wow.
And I virtually fell in my chair. I could not believe it, because I had been telling people that was one of the things I was researching, that I had just begun to research in Project Pegasus around 2000, 11 years after my dad asked me to tell the story.
Wow.
And I finally got done with all my advanced schooling and passed the bar and took too many other bar exams I didn't need to take, and finally got around to investigating my experiences in Pegasus in the year 2000. And here, 2 years later, we can thank the Lord for the great Dr. David Lewis Anderson to be revealing that use of the Montauk Chair involving thousands of American school children. And I was one of them.
Wow. Wow.
And I've run into many people who are being used in the Montauk Chair.
Yes, I saw one talk you gave, and one of the gals there at the talk had a more recent experience in a slightly different Montauk Chair. Now, they didn't call it Montauk Chair, but what did they call it? The chair, or?
Well, they just called it to us the chair.
Okay.
And, I found a number of the kids who had been in it, and one of them said, "Oh, we played that game." And another said, "Oh, yeah, I remember sitting in that chair and being weirded out." I said to both of them, "Did you realize that was my fellow experiencers named David, Marianne, I don't want to give their last names." And I said, "Do you realize that whole books have been written about that device? That wasn't a game. That was a time travel device." And it later got set up in an entire program at at Montauk, Long Island, at Camp Hero, the naval station there.
Right. And
there were a series of books written by Preston Nichols and Peter Moon about Project Montauk. And there was another aspect of that I was going to mention. Oh, I confirmed their claims about Project Montauk because look, I had been in the chair and their descriptions corresponded, and they said that Jack Pruitt was the research director of Project Montauk. Well, I had encountered Jack, who was one of the principal team leaders years earlier in Project Pegasus. And as I mentioned during the previous episode, The Quest for Truth, my last meeting with Jack Pruitt was in June of 2003 at the old, now no longer existing, Sweeney Auditorium in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with Jack Pruitt's late son, Glenn Pruitt, and he. And it makes perfect sense in the developmental timeline of Project Montauk that Jack Pruitt would have gone from being a team leader on DARPA's Project Pegasus to the research director of the Navy or DARPA's Project Montauk. So I confirm that, and all those gentlemen, including Stuart Swerdlow, reified my truth value when I appeared on Conspiracy with Jesse Ventura. Although Governor Ventura, as I stated during a previous show, ended up defaming me at the end of the show by stating that I was a mind control victim who had never time traveled, which is just not true. It's just a made-up cover story by the Navy, apparently, to suppress my truth campaign by defaming me, which is still going on.
Terrible.
Some very distinguished people have been involved in that disinformational program. But I will rise above the fray and not mention those people and not focus on the negativists who wish to snap at my heels like a wounded dog, because, as I said, my goal was to be both an inspiration and a warning. An inspiration about the potential of things like teleportation in real time for virtually instantaneous travel, and to be a warning about the destruction of privacy occasioned by the development of Chronovision.
Yes. Wow. The Montauk Chair. Very, very.
Yeah, so that was number 3, was the Montauk Chair, and it was definitely the Montauk Chair. And my claims don't really in any way emanate from or depend on the works by Nichols and Moon, because Dr. Anderson's statement on Coast to Coast AM in 2002 reified the time that I had always given, which was that I was placed in the Montauk Chair in 1970. So that's QED, as they say in logic and metaphysics, quo errata demonstratum. I proved it.
Okay.
That was the actual time when the U.S. government started placing children in the Montauk Chair. And by the way, the Montauk Chair was a reverse engineered pilot seat from a downed extraterrestrial craft that the pilot, the ET pilot, was using to see where they were going through space and know what was out there before they hit it, so that their craft wasn't destroyed by asteroids or planetoids or space dust or what have you, space junk. I mean, our whole, as Captain Cousteau, wrote about, our whole planet is covered by space junk at this point.
Yeah.
We may have lost the Challenger and the Columbia space shuttles from simply striking space dust. We don't know. I mean, there were theories regarding, the O-rings that Morton Thiokol produced for the Challenger and the angle of re-entry into our atmosphere with the Columbia.
Yeah.
But certainly the Columbia may have just struck space junk.
Yeah, I think the Columbia came in at an odd angle and it just tore it apart because of aerodynamics. It wasn't built.
Entirely possible. That was their finding. But I'm just saying that it's dangerous to travel in our atmosphere and the near Earth environment now, because our whole planet is covered by 4,000 or more pieces of space junk.
Yes.
From our own satellites, for example, that have exploded and just are going around our planet now. We really have to clean up our skies to make travel in it safer.
I think China now has a junk collecting satellite that goes around, can bump things down into an orbit where they'll decay, and it catches the little stuff, I think. So that it seems like it might be underway. not a moment too soon, as you say. You know, they track all the nuts and bolts flying around in space, so they can always, miss it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Well, perhaps they will succeed there in addressing their increasingly profound economic and social disarray, and have the capacity then to clean up the skies. That'd be a great thing.
Yeah, I think we all should be doing that. You get some kids who play video games to play a video game, but instead they're blasting away these little particles in space.
Yeah.
Have them use that. So now, what's number 4? What's the fourth method?
Number 4 is the teleporter.
Teleporter.
Now, the teleporter was referred to in DARPA shop manuals of that era, and I know this because one of those shop manuals was on our hot water heater in our basement in New Jersey. It was known as the Tesla energetic array. Now, when that technology was first found in the papers that Nikola left upon his death on January 7th of 1943, when he died at the New Yorker Hotel in Manhattan, it was simply labeled energetic array.
Right.
And I know that what happened is they set up that device on the floor of a room in Building 68 at the Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, and they turned it on. And when the radiant energy was flowing downward through these two elliptical-shaped booms or armatures, one of the technicians walked through the array of energy to get a screwdriver across the shop floor and tumbled to Africa. And it took him something like 6 weeks to 6 months to get home, because of course the particular African tribe that he found himself among was thinking, this guy must be a god or something. How did he just suddenly appear here, right? And he finally explained he was a scientist from the United States and got home. And when he walked through the door, his supervisor actually collapsed, because from his perspective, he thought his colleague had been disintegrated by the energetic array, whatever Tesla did. And he explained how he had teleported to Africa through a vortal tunnel. They then tried it with a team of volunteers consisting of Navy enlisted personnel. And my dad said that unfortunately those brave American chrononauts died from asphyxiation because the vortal tunnel that was opened up was too long and they had run out of oxygen. They then did it on shorter hops, quicker passages through acceptably long tunnels, and had perfected it with Navy enlisted. They then used it on children, as I described during a previous episode of The Quest for Truth. They were negotiating with other countries to bring the poorest of the poor kids up to our country, involve them in classified defense-related research and development programs, like I was involved as an American kid. And if they survived uninjured, they would be dismissed from the program and get everything in America that they did not have at home, like parent, homes to live in, clothing, food, shelter, educations, employment when they grew up. In other words, we were engaged in sort of this Faustian deal where we would use foreign kids, but then if they survived uninjured or even were injured, would then get everything in America that they were denied at home. And I was then in the third group of teleportees who were bright, healthy children from stable church-going families, like they could expect the children of our executive branch officials to be: the president, the vice president, the secretaries of state, defense, and so forth. They knew that the American political class was usually raising fairly solid kids. I mean, once in a while, a child would have a problem with drugs or alcohol or self-esteem or depression or whatever. But generally speaking, were fairly intact American kids. So as a very intact, bright, healthy, an American kid from a stable, middle-class, church-going household, they dropped me in among those 140 kids who were then used in Project Pegasus. And now, when I asked my dad, was I the first kid to do that, when you took me up to Curtis Wright in early 1968, like January, February of 1968, and we jumped to New Mexico, he said, no, but undoubtedly the first American child. So that is my claim to fame as a U.S. chrononaut. I was the first American child to Tesla teleport. And, we teleported from Curtis Wright to Santa Fe. As my dad predicted, before we reached Santa Fe, he was pulled through the wall of the Vortal Tunnel, because the Vortal Tunnels would sometimes sort of be naturally compartmentalized into different streams.
Mm-hmm.
And it took him about a half hour to find me, because I didn't listen to what my dad had asked of me. I was walking all over the state capitol complex in Santa Fe looking for him. So we were sort of not finding each other, because I wasn't staying in one place. We were kind of two lost individuals looking for each other, which creates more randomness than just one of them staying where they are. But he finally found me about a half hour later, and he got a car from the state of New Mexico, and we drove over into a meeting with Dr. Harold Agnew. And when Dr. Agnew said to my dad, "How was your trip?" my dad said, "Fine and fast." And Harold looked up from the paperwork my dad had been presenting to him and said, "Oh, did you take the teleporter?" And my dad said, "Yep." And then turned to me and said, "So did my number 3 son, Andrew." And Dr. Agnew looked over at me and said to my dad, "How old?" And my dad and I said at the same time, 6. So that was a very important discussion, because that means that teleportation was operational between my 6th birthday on September 18th, 1967, and my 7th birthday on September 18th of 1968. Or I otherwise would not have said, just as my dad did, that I was 6 when Dr. Agnew said, in reference to me, to my father, "How old?" In other words, "How old is your son?"
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
I remember that story for the gentility of that generation. That they were often criticized for being excessively conservative, but I really felt that generation that got through the Depression and fought World War II was, as Tom Brokaw said, the greatest generation, because I remember the gentility by which, for example, somebody like Dr. Agnew, who had served in all critical stages of Project Manhattan, said to my dad in reference to me, as if it really mattered, "How old? How old, Ray? How old is your son?" And then, of course, he later said at the La Hacienda, "Ray, your son looks just like you, or at least as you must have looked at his age."
Mm.
So that was number 4, the teleporter. And that was the primary reason I came forward. It was my dad's dream and purpose, and my own, to bring about global public teleportation in real time.
Yes.
Why? Because when I was on the project, after acclimating us to teleporting in real time, or, real-time delivery. So, for example, when I would jump from New Jersey to New Mexico, it would be 2 hours earlier when I arrived in New Mexico than New Jersey time. Now, I would jump through there like at 9:30, and it would be 7:30 in the Santa Fe State Capitol grounds, and people were just starting to walk to work, the early arrivals.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I was on Project Pegasus, they found a way to adjust the teleporter so that you would arrive in what we call the past or the future. Now, through that teleporter, I was able to live what I call my 4 hidden summers in New Mexico. Those were the summers of 1970, 71, 73, accessed from fall of 71, and then 72. And in the case of all four of those summers, I would jump to New Mexico, spend a summer there, and then jump back to New Jersey at the end of that summer in New Mexico so as to arrive 15 minutes after I had originally left.
Wow.
And then I would relive those summers. So I relived a second summer of 1970, a second summer of 1971. Then I jumped back to the fall of 1971 and then progressed in real time so as to be able to jump to the first summer of 72 in New Mexico after having already spent the summer of 73 at that rental house in White Rock that I took Governor Ventura to.
Wow.
Remember where the lady had heard of Dr. Harold Agnew and Project Pegasus?
Yeah.
And then I again returned to the beginning of the summer of 72. And then when we moved to California in November of 72, I then had a second summer of 72 after having already lived one a year and a half earlier in New Mexico. So I was basically being moved around as a chrononaut in a way, Aaron, that took me years to deconstruct what the actual timeline was.
I bet.
Because, you know, when you jump somewhere else and live a summer there and then jump back so as to arrive 15 minutes before you left, your timeline is obfuscated just by the repetitions of two summers.
Yeah.
And I had the offset also of the trip from fall of 1971 to the beginning of the summer of 73. So it was quite a task and took me years to deconstruct the actual timeline of my service on Project Pegasus.
So I have a question about that. So you're in these extra summers. So the second time you experience a summer you previously experienced, were you like showing off, like when a TV show would come on and go, I know what's going to happen next. I know what team's going to win.
I was living in New Mexico in a way which I couldn't even turn on the television.
Oh, I see.
One time I did, and I also called my mother.
Oh, really?
And by the way,
really?
I called my mother from the summer of 1973 in New Mexico, 3 weeks after arriving there.
Wow.
In fact, I asked Connie Chavez for what the area code in New Jersey was, and she said, you mean when I call your dad? And I said, yeah. And she said 201.
Wow.
So I let them go to down from White Rock to Santa Fe or Los Alamos or Albuquerque, and I was just left alone at the house, and I dialed 201-539-4948, which was our phone number at that time.
Uh-huh.
And I said, Mom, and she said, yeah. And you know who this is? And she said, yeah, my son Andrew. And I said, yeah, I'm in a secret project with Dad, and I'm in New Mexico in the summer of 1973. And now, that was 3 weeks into my stay, and then we jumped back to the beginning of the summer of 71. And then 3 weeks later, my mom took that call from me in New Mexico and looked from the kitchen down to our rec room where I was playing and said to me on the phone, which I received in summer of 73, no, you're not. I'm looking at you right down there in the rec room. And then when my father came home from work back in the fall of 71, after that happened, she said, Ray, something quite strange happened today. He said, what? And he said, well, she said, I got a call from Andy, and he said he was in a secret project with you in New Mexico, and it was the beginning of the summer of 1973. But then when I looked and I was talking to him on the phone, I looked down into the rec room and he was sitting there playing by himself without the phone in his hand. And my dad said, well, maybe he went next door to the Connors and played a trick on you by calling you from their phone. And she said, no, Ray, he was right down there in our rec room. It wasn't at the Connors. And then my dad said, well, you know how psychic he is. Maybe he used his psychic performance, just talk to your mind. But in fact, I had used the phone at that rental house at 20 Grand Canyon in White Rock from summer of 73.
Wow.
3 weeks into my offset in the summer of 73. But she got that call 3 weeks after we returned to fall of 1971. So I've used that to express sort of a parallel nature of alternate timelines in the multiverse.
Wow.
You see, there was a trapezoidal offset of those two timelines because my mother received a call from me exactly 3 weeks into our return to New Jersey in fall of 1971.
Wow. I've never heard you talk about that before. That's really interesting.
Well, it's in my book. It will be published.
Awesome.
It's one of 300 chapters.
Now, I've heard you say that
Stories like that.
I've heard you say that 90% of your story is untold, but told in your book.
Correct.
Wow.
Still it.
You think that
There's no way that those who seeking to advance themselves by any preemptive or misappropriative uses of my works, and I won't name names, but I think many will know who I'm talking about, will be succeeding because I've kept so much back, even while being
good for you,
falsely accused of being an agent of the deep state. When what have I done? I revealed the deep state's most sensitive secret at risk of being assassinated by the deep state, and I was blinded from either the effects of my service or actual targeting with directed energy weapons. I don't know which, but I won't make the mistake of concretizing speculation into fact, and I would urge all of those in the truth movement to resist that propensity. We have some very major figures in our field who have a penchant for concretizing mere speculation into fact, and that's not a scientific approach to social science. That's ultimately a pseudo-scientific approach to social science, and I won't engage in that. But I was either blinded by diabetic retinopathy from the disease that mimicked diabetes that Jack Pruitt warned me about in 2003, or by targeting with directed energy weapons, and there was some evidence of that when I was running for president in 2016, and I'm not blinded to that possibility. I just don't know. So it's just like, when somebody gets cancer, they don't know whether it was a genetic propensity or some chemical they were exposed to, or radiation that was used for their thyroid or what have you. There are many different roads to cancer, many different recoveries from it. So it doesn't advance our health or our longevity to speculate about our health and concretize speculation into fact. That's a dangerous practice I would urge anybody 40, 60, 80 years of age to avoid. I just won't go there. I mean, if it's possible that my vision was damaged by targeting, but there was enough to go on already that I had a form of metabolic disruption that essentially was very much like diabetes. And what does diabetes do? Excess glucose attacks the eyes, the heart, the kidney, and the veins. That's why I've done a full court press urging everybody to fight their diabetes. I think we should encourage fasting blood glucose testing as much as warning people about the dangers of cigarette smoking. I think we should distribute those new glucose monitors where you don't have to prick your skin to every American of whatever age, so everybody can begin to monitor the glucose in their bloodstreams. It's very dangerous. There's only three things we do with glucose, right? We burn it as energy, we store it as fat, or we do neither, and it floats around in our bloodstream as glucose, and that is diabetes mellitus. And it is very damaging of those four systems, the eyes, the heart, the kidneys, and the veins, and shortens human life and the quality thereof. And God willing, there will be devices to restore my vision and my kidney function, and we are waiting for those advances to be completed. But they are on the way, as are many things. So I would urge everybody to be quite hopeful about where the bionic revolution is going to be going over the next 5 to 10 years, and know that they should do the very best to preserve the health that they have for that reason.
Yes, it's excellent advice. Thank you, Andy. Yes, take care of your temple. Your body is your temple. So that's the teleporter. You're a couple years older than you really are because of this, because of living those extra summers. A couple, 2.5 years,
Right,
perhaps.
right. When I turned 60 on September 18th of 2021, I was actually turning 61. So this September 18th, when I'm chronologically turning 61, I will, in fact, be biologically 62.
Mm-hmm. But maybe if we spin...
That's the nature of quantum displacement. My dad was chronologically 66 years of age at his death in 1990, but he had said that he and Raymond Kubick of Parsons sat down and found that he had spent 8 years in quantum displacement in New Mexico. So when he died in 1990, biologically, he was actually 74.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's wild. That is
Yeah,
just...
and when I met Courtney Hunt, again in my career in 1981, I had originally met Courtney in the early 70s when he'd come back from the year 2200, and he was entering the curtilage of the Cerrillos Cultural Center in New Mexico, and he was asked where he had been, and he said Los Angeles, and he said, what time? And he said the 2200s, and they said, oh, wow, what was it like? And he described something like out of the movie Blade Runner.
Wow.
I met up with Courtney again in summer of 81 because he was scheduled to become my second Mars training officer, and he was the individual controlling the aeronautical repositioning chamber at 999 North Sepulveda in El Segundo when I took my first jump to Mars on July 7th of 1981. And Courtney Hunt told me he was 50 in 1981. Well, ordinarily, that would have meant a birth year of 1931. Mm-hmm. And then years later, when I said, Courtney, what year were you born? He said 1937. And that was 6 years of quantum displacement, just as my dad had 8 and I had 1. And, Bernie Mendez told me he was born 5 years before me in 1956. But when I met Bernie on Pegasus, I could tell he was about 10 years older. And now Bernie does not have medical symptoms of a 66-year-old. He has medical symptoms of like a 75-year-old.
Wow. I have a question about 999 North Sepulveda Boulevard. I have a picture of that building up here right now. And I was thinking about this today. You know how the symbolism is big for some of these people? Well, 999 upside down is 666. Did you see?
But I said that to Courtney Hunt. I joked ruefully as he was taking me to 999 North Sepulveda.
Okay.
In those days, it was just 3 little metal numbers beneath the awning of the first floor of the building as you walk into the center elevator and up to check in at the Fijian Suite on the 5th floor.
Okay. And
then go up to the 8th floor and have it morph from a box into a cylinder and then deliver you to Mars, right?
Wow.
I said, Courtney, oh, great. You're sending me to Mars for the first time in a building in El Segundo with the number 666 upside down. I guess it'll read 666 when I get to Mars. And he laughed. Wow. Ruefully, as only a cigarette-smoking man from the CIA can laugh. So, yes, but I think that wasn't. I think that was just a coincidence. Okay. It could have been something selected by Howard Hughes, the director of the program, suggesting that by going to another planet, they were going to help reverse the emergence of the anti-Christian, Luciferian rebellion being successful on Earth or something like that. I don't know.
Right.
But I think because of the advanced nature of the people I was working with, they just picked that building because it was right south of the LA airport. Just this nondescript Bauhaus building. And in those days, it was all just sort of tungsten steel with dark blue windows. It wasn't sort of that funky building that's there now with the
glass,
that huge sort of California cuisine decoupage decoration on the north side of the building.
Right. Interesting. Wow.
You know, Frank Jacob, the filmmaker, went out there to the 8th floor. I think it was the 8th floor, but very high up in that building. And he was pounced upon by 4 security agents, including a guy riding a motor scooter, and asked what he was doing there. And to his credit, Frank prevaricated to protect himself and said he was a musician from Europe who was scouting a location for an MTV video. And they said, well, Mr. Jacob, fine, but you have to leave because there's classified activities going on here. So I hope to be doing an appearance with Frank Jacob on Gary Leger, the Mad Martian's Martian Revelation show, at some future date.
Okay.
To discuss his investigation of my information about chronovision and his own derivation of the Guardians of the Looking Glass story. But there's an example of somebody who was going in search of the truth,
Mm-hmm.
who was on the quest for the truth, and who ended up essentially verifying what I said about 999 North Sepulveda.
Wow. Fantastic. Well, that's a teleporter. Now, what's number 5?
Oh, but by the way, they ended up calling it the Tesla energetic array, but it was just the energetic array. But a couple things about that.
Okay.
Let's just stay on the teleporter for a while.
Sure.
Madeline Engel, in her book A Wrinkle in Time, stated that the device was a tesseract, and realizing that was a contraction of Tesla energetic array, and that she also had a theme involving Pegasus and a main character, Charles Wallace, or CW, which was Curtis Wright, and so forth. I took that book to my father and said, "Oh yes, that's we call that disinformation." Also, there's one other thing about the teleport. When the technician at Curtis Wright went to Africa, Sean David Morton claimed on an episode of Coast to Coast AM that the first human being to teleport in that way was Maitreya, and that was just not true.
Right.
There may have been an overlap with the story about Maitreya that Sean told and the actual experience of the technician at Curtis Wright who went to Africa, but it was not Maitreya or any other luminary. It was just a common shop floor technician working for Curtis Wright. And I do not have his name, but he survived.
Wow. Well, yeah, I think the Tesla
So
teleporter.
that was the teleporter, and I did about, I don't know, maybe 20 or 40 trips across the country with adjustments for time ultimately.
And now you said in the past when you looked down, it felt like you were going down. You looked forward, it looked like you were going forward. That must have been freaky.
Yes, it was. And the kids would sometimes even spin around like you would with the spin out at the amusement park.
Sure.
But I would always kind of stiffen up. I remember seeing pictures of a young Harry Truman and a young Henry Luce of Lifetime or Time Life. And I remember stiffening up like that because I did not want to play around on the trip to New Mexico or back to New Jersey. Now, that weekend in either direction, we would be decanted in a grassy area in Solon, Ohio, and walk down a street and across an intersection, and we would go into the Swagelok headquarters. Swagelok was a precision pipe fitting company started by a man named Fred Lennon, and there was a teleporter over on the right side of that building. So we would go in, and they would usher us into a teleporter and say, "Where do you want to go, New Jersey or New Mexico?" And we would just jump through that teleporter. So the teleporter sometimes weakened, and we were decanted to Solon, Ohio.
Wow. Right
there in the existing or ultimate congressional district of Dennis Kucinich. And I met Congressman Kucinich in Portland, like in 2000, I don't know, 7 or so.
Okay.
I think he was planning to run, or did run for president in 2008 or 2004, and whichever it was, whatever race Kucinich was in, and I did not get the opportunity to tell him that I was actually being decanted via teleportation to the Swagelok headquarters building in his congressional district, which included Solon, Ohio.
Wow. Now, this, I think I might have asked you this before, but it seems like there are only certain places you could teleport to. Do you think that might have been because of ley lines or maybe energetic areas that just facilitated those?
No, it was being set at the sending place.
Okay.
And you would arrive where it was set to, and it had to do with the function of the energy passing through the device.
Interesting.
And hence that time that I discussed on the last episode of The Quest for Truth, where the radiant energy was sort of going through the device too quickly.
Mm-hmm, right.
And my dad and I shot past the Santa Fe State Capitol grounds, the Mexico State Capitol grounds in Santa Fe, into that neighborhood in Santa Fe, and we sought out the help of that Los Alamos National Lab employee, Cristobal Sanchez, and his son, Edward, remembered that incident, meeting me and saying that the water in the device was falling too quickly.
Right.
By which I meant the radiant energy that the Tesla energetic array was emitting when we jumped through it to access the mortal tunnel.
Wow.
And arrive in Santa Fe. But we overshot the state capitol grounds by a mile or so.
And
I have somewhere in my notes, I have the name of that street. I could probably find it again.
And
somebody actually took me a picture of that house for me, but I don't even remember the name of the person who did that back in like 2004 or 5. So it's somewhere in my notes.
So when you're running through the teleporter, I remember you said once that you'd have to like cross your arms over your chest and not be flailing your arms as you ran through, or your legs, because you could lose a limb, perhaps?
Well, we had to get through the energy at least a meter per second, or we would lose that part of the body that was dragging. So they taught us to jump through the energy like a halfback going over the line in football, or they used the example of somebody holding a loaf of bread who was then jumping through into a ground story window, which is hard to do when you're 6 years old.
Yeah.
I gave it my best, and fortunately was not injured initially.
My goodness. I mean,
I don't know. Maybe the energy of that device, by damaging my metabolic functioning, was the cause of damage to my visual and renal cortexes.
That could be.
That's what Jack Pruitt sort of suggested in 2003.
Wow.
But at least I was not dismembered by the technology.
Yeah.
And they showed it by shoving a standard house broom halfway in, slowly, in through the radiant energy, and it just cracked in half. One part got teleported somewhere, and the other went flying through the room.
Wow.
So it was very violent if you didn't jump through quickly.
Oh my goodness. Well, maybe they should have have a trap door, and when you fall through the trap door, you go through the energy field at the speed you're supposed to.
That's an idea. Maybe you want to get that patented.
Yeah.
The dismemberment-free teleportation.
Yeah, don't flap your arms. Just
platform.
Just drop. I guess kind of like the that would be like the plasma confinement, because like a trapdoor sort of effect opened up under you there, but we're not talking about that yet, are we?
Correct.
Okay, that's the teleporter. Anything else you want to mention about the teleporter? I think it's a fascinating thing.
No, just that we were vulnerable to the mortal tunnel. I don't believe people are going to have to travel in that way when we standardize teleportation. Mm-hmm. I have invented a device to do that. It would be a Kevlar platform like the inside of a commercial airliner, but it would just be seats. with a sort of a fuselage around it, but no wings,
Mm-hmm.
no pilot's cabin, no
Sure.
tails,
Yeah.
no stabilizer, no restrooms, nothing. It would just be a vort or vehicle of recumbent teleportation. So people would sit in that and would be fluffed through the teleporter, and then a couple seconds later, the doors would open up and you would be at the destination.
That'd be great.
And that always blew people away. Even Dr. Agnew, when we were decanted in Solon, Ohio, and he was almost knocked off his feet. And he said, this is just unbelievable. You couldn't believe it. They did it, how quickly they went places.
Yeah.
But in other words, the public moving around the world via teleportation, when it's introduced in global public teleportation, will be inside a Kevlar containment area or seating area that itself will be thrust in teleportation. And if that's unsafe medically, I am not urging that teleportation be used on people, that it just be used to bring goods around the world, so we can get rid of those 16 and 22-wheeler trucks that every day in America are causing many, many deaths and injuries from traffic accidents. We lose in America to traffic fatalities and have as many people injured as we lost during the entire, or had injured during the entire 13 years of the Vietnam War.
Wow.
That was 50,000 deaths and 300,000 serious combat injuries during the 13 years of the Vietnam conflict. Every year in America, we have that from automobile and truck and bus transit. So if we just use teleportation to get these huge trucks off our highways, we will be saving thousands and thousands of deaths and preventing hundreds of thousands of injuries.
Yes.
And that's why I knew I had an ethical obligation to speak out, even why some very mentally imbalanced individuals might, at some point in their career, either allege that I'm an agent of the deep state or revive such claims long after somebody has changed their position. That just happened recently, and I won't refer to who did it or what is involved, but I am somewhat tired after 4 years of valor in childhood and 4 years of valor in young adulthood serving our country, and then 20 years of honor informing the people of America and the people of the world what this project was doing, still have to hear charges that I'm working for somebody. If I was working for somebody, maybe I would have had the money to buy the Avastin to stop my retinas from bleeding. I wouldn't be blind today.
Wow.
So I don't want to hear that talk. It's not fair to me.
Right.
I have paid a lot for my service and my truth-telling and my lack of medical care when I needed it. Okay?
Well,
so let's not attack our heroes. That's a theme I've already voiced on the Quest for Truth. Let's just honor our heroes. I was disgusted when everything I was promised for serving in Pegasus and Mars was denied, and then I heard that Armstrong and Aldrin got pensions of $700 a month when they came back from the moon. That's probably what all of our 12 NASA astronauts who walked on the moon were pensioned at. $700 a month?
What?
It's pretty pathetic, America. We have to start paying and first appreciating our heroes.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And, well, you know what? We have some truth warriors here that are all going to be putting you in our prayers to help heal you and get you better. And also, I think everyone here is interested in your book as soon as it becomes available. So when that happens, there'll be a way to help you. As
soon as I can start to make the money again.
That would be a great way that people could help support you.
And when I run for the Senate, I'm going to increase the amount of money on reserve that a the disabled can have, which should be jumped from $2,000 to $10,000. And I will commit myself as a U.S. Senator to achieving social security in our country, not social insecurity.
Yes.
I could do a whole show on that with you.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe we should.
Maybe we should. Yeah, there's a lot of things with the Social Security system that's, like you said, social insecurity. It keeps you poor, prevents you from making a living. It's sad. It really
Crazy.
is sad. It's not American.
We should clearly pension government servants
Mm-hmm.
as just a standard salary for having served.
Yeah.
They shouldn't even be the same systems, but they're being used for that.
Yeah.
When they are paying our veterans. I mean, only some of our Vietnam veterans, let's say, got coverage for PTSD. And just how can you remain mentally intact when you see your best friends getting their head shot off?
Oh, boy.
A little bit stressful.
Yes. Well, Cheryl says, thank you for your service, Andy. And that's sentiment.
Well, thank you. That's quite kind.
Yeah. People are saying very nice things.
Okay, so the next one, Aaron, is the Chronovisor.
Chronovisor.
Now, what was the Chronovisor? When I encountered the Chronovisor in 1970, it was a crystal array made of 8-sided bismuth crystals in the ceiling. My father later explained that they were driving an EM signal, by which he meant an electromagnetic current through those bismuth crystals, causing a cube of light to pop out on a stage. Now, when you looked at that light, you saw into the past or future. And as Jack Pruitt used the phrase a couple of times, in that vein, the Chronovisor served as a looking glass. So I, in fact, reified the probable existence of Project Looking Glass for the same reason I reified the probable existence of Project Montauk, because both the Chronovisor or looking glass and the Montauk Chair, or just the chair as it was called when I was on the project, were very effective means of quantum access. And it would have made sense to just spin off separate research programs focusing on just those standalone technologies. Now, when you were in the cube of light, when you were on the stage and it was turned on around you, you immediately went to that time and place that was focused in the cube of light. So I would stand on the stage in the first summer of 71. The Chronovisor array was on the symphony orchestra stage over in the right and to the back of the Cerrillos Cultural Center in Cerrillos, New Mexico. And they would turn the device on, and as the cube of light surrounded me instantaneously, I went to the street in front of Forest Theater and walked into the entry of the lobby, where there was a table where they were taking tickets for those attending that night's performance of Our American Cousin, starring Laura Keene. Now, the derivation of the Chronovisor was clearly with the Vatican musicologist, Father Pellegrino Ernetti, and his colleague, Father Augustino, or Pier Maria Gemelli, because they had been working on a specialized microphone to split the voices in Gregorian chant, when, as Vatican musicologists at the Catholic University of Milan in the 1940s, they were trying to study Gregorian chants to see why they had, for example, healing properties and spiritually resonant effects on listeners, which are pretty strong. And I listen to Gregorian chants sometimes, and they're pretty powerful for that reason. And when they made this slight incremental change on the specialized microphone used to split the voices in the Gregorian chants, something that Gemelli's father had said to him in childhood, when the elder Gemelli's nickname for Father Augustino Gemelli was the Italian phrase for my little zucchini, because that was the word, zucchini. Mm-hmm. And they thought, oh my God, we have a window to the past. So they got on the same team with the famous Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, and by 1952, they had a flat-screen television screen that they used to depict things like the crucifixion of Jesus. And there was an ancient Roman poem that they recovered the complete words of and so forth. Mm-hmm. Now, that was in 1952. I encountered the developmental stage of the chronovisors 18 years later, when the Vatican had already passed the technology on to the U.S. Navy. The Navy had passed it on to DARPA. DARPA had associated Bell Labs of Murray Hill, New Jersey, and Bell Labs had converted the flat-screen television into a cube of light because they realized it had this holographic potential, not just to allow the chronovisor to be a looking glass into the past or future, but to be a time travel device to the past, and they hoped the future. Now, when I did get on it in 1970, I was then placed in the first group of U.S. chrononauts who went forward via Chronovision. That was that probe on November 5th of 1971 at ITT Defense Communications in Nutley, New Jersey. And about 6 of us went about a half hour forward in time. We were then trained when there were 3 tugs to look to the left and right. And what I saw was the U.S. Supreme Court building about under 100 feet of brackish water. And then quickly after I saw that, they pulled me back for a half hour. I just had to zone out like they taught us to. And then I was back on the stage in New Jersey, and they were taking off my suit, pouring out my shoes on the stage, and I said, "Where's my dad?" And one of the docents from DARPA said, "He had to be by himself, Andrew. When we sent you forward in time, you all disappeared, and he thought you were gone." So,
oh, wow.
Now, that was my second singular accomplishment of a first-time nature as a U.S. chrononaut. That was the first group of U.S. chrononauts to go forward in time via chronovision, just as I had been the first American child to test the teleport anywhere. But anyway, I did a lot of probes via chronovisor, initially to the past. And the first was to a Civil War battle being fought, and the Confederates, I was behind the Union lines, and there was a mustachioed sergeant. It may have been Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, I don't know, but somebody who looked like Sergeant Chamberlain, the famous hero of Gettysburg, waving his sword with his big lamb chop mustache, going, "Boy, boy, get off this field. You're going to be killed, son." But before I could do so, the Confederates overran their position, and I hid under a berm with these Confederate soldiers jumping over me. Some of them would actually stop and look at me as if to decide, should we bayonet this little kid? And they would say, "Oh, no, he's just a little kid. Let him go." And I would just wave my hands and go, "I'm not in the battle. I'm not in the battle." But we had been told that if we were sent somewhere via chronovision and we had not been there for 15 minutes, a density effect would not have occurred yet, where we would have gone from 3rd to 4th dimensional chronovision. If we did, we were stuck there, and they had to insert a portal that looks sort of like a soccer goal. Mm-hmm. And when we ran towards that portal, we would find ourselves in a tunnel, a dark tunnel with sand getting deeper and deeper, and then we would see a metal dinosaur at the end of the tunnel, and we knew we were back at this amusement park in New Jersey. I believe it was a defunct amusement park that had been known as Bertram's Island amusement park. And we'd always tap on that metallic dinosaur statue because it meant we were back in the present. And then we would be driven by a hippy-dippy van driver that looked just like the comedian Leo Gallagher He had the tam o' shanters that Leo Gallagher wears, and I would talk to him. He told me his name was, I believe, Leo. And there was an Elaine Gallagher who was our principal special educator on the project. I've been trying to reach Leo Gallagher to ask him, do you remember busing gifted kids involved in some DARPA project that one of the little kids was always telling you about? And you'd be saying, oh, wow, far out, man. You're doing what? Oh, God, I can't even believe it. I think he thought I was just a bright kid who was telling science fiction stories. But anyway, we would sort of be decanted through that teleporter to an area behind that tunnel and then walk back into the present. It was like a jungle gym and some swing stuff that we would just play in until the Leo Gallagher look-alike in the little school bus would show up and take us back to the Chronovisor array in Morristown, New Jersey.
Wow.
It was held in the Morristown Performing Arts Center, which was then undergoing historical redevelopment from a building originally built in the 1870s. And I know that the Vatican origins of Chronovision are true, because one time in fall of 1971, I was standing on the stage expecting to be chronovised somewhere, and one of the technicians said, Andy, that priest in the back of the room be given a tour, that's Father Ernetti, one of the developers of Chronovision. I just want you to know that, so you could appreciate the seriousness of his visit to our facility today.
Wow.
So Ernetti was back in the back of the room, kind of be giving a tour of honor.
Wow.
As one of the originators of the Chronovisor, or Chronovisor, as they say in Italian.
Wow.
I did not meet Father Ernetti, but I saw him, and it corresponded to later pictures of Pellegrino Ernetti that I saw, for example, in the reporting that Father Francois Brunet did about the Vatican origins of the Chronovisor. Chronovisor.
So interesting. Man. And the fact that they were able
to... And then, of course, Wynne Keach, the British researcher, dug up that patent that was granted the brilliant Japanese-American physicist Leo Atsaki, also spelled Isaki, granted in 1967, into his work in, guess what, 8-sided bismuth crystals. And who did he find listed in the first listing of the prior arts or prior work section of that patent?
Your dad.
My late father, Raymond Basiago.
Yep.
About his work on, guess what? Bismuth crystals.
Wow. So
the bismuth crystal connection was one of the Project Pegasus proofs that I discussed during that recent episode of the Quest for Truth.
Yeah, that's an awesome one right there. So awesome. So interesting. Wow, the Chronovisor. I mean, we could go on forever on that, but I suppose you want to get to number 6.
Yeah, number 6 was the plasma confinement chamber. Now, primarily, that was the quantum access device that was used by Dr. Sterling Colgate, the past president and dean of physics of the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology, or NMIST, also known as New Mexico Tech, in Socorro, New Mexico, that I had known primarily as the individual directing the graduate students in physics under his charge at New Mexico Tech, analyzing images taken back from the future at a C-shaped Aerojet Corporation facility in Socorro, right next to the research library of New Mexico Tech at the corner of Bullock Avenue and Leroy Place in Socorro. That C-shaped building is no longer there. The Aerojet facility has moved in deeper into the New Mexico Tech campus. But the area where that C-shaped Aerojet building was is now kind of a swale. There's kind of a pond there. It kind of collapsed, and they made it into a sort of a natural area, possibly to hide the damage that was done to it when it was that C-shaped Aerojet Corporation facility. That's, after all, where my dad and I were shown the images of 9/11 in 1971. But so I had known Dr. Colgate from that location previously, when my father and I were in New Mexico and would drive down from Albuquerque, for example, to Socorro to visit that Aerojet Corporation facility, or Dr. Colgate. Now, Dr. Colgate and my father were administering a plasma confinement chamber at a brick building in East Hanover on Ridgedale Avenue and School Street in East Hanover, New Jersey. My father explained that that brick building without windows had previously been a chemical company. I think today it's a Presbyterian church. And interestingly, there's like a police squad car parked in the driveway in front of it. But the plasma confinement chamber was essentially a lucite chamber about 12 feet high, and its width was about half the width of a tennis court, and it was about as long as both sides of a standard tennis court, used by the professional tennis players of today. So it was a rather large lucite cube. The plasma, after you walk into a door on the right side, over on the left side of that cube of lucite, there would be radioactive plasma under confinement, swirling around with its distinctively opalescent color. Interestingly, my dad was giving me shots of vanadium in the left calf every week.
Wow.
During the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade years that I was time traveling. And when I said, Dad, why are you giving me this shot? He said, to protect your teeth and bones from radiation.
Wow.
So it was probably the radiation of the plasma confinement chamber. It was radioactive plasma. Now, when have some of the time slips occurred naturally? Well, like during Fukushima, when plasma is released by shifting of the tectonic plates of the Earth, there have been natural time slips, like the Montélimar, France time slip by the 2 British couples, the Gibneys and the Simpson, where they stopped at Montélimar, France, on their way between the Channel, across the English Channel, and Nice in the south of France, and they stopped in Montélimar, and the bed and breakfast had no windows, just wooden shutters. They could close at night, and the bar mistress didn't know the modern French word for motorway, and they were charged 4 pence for a full, multi-course French breakfast.
Wow.
It's 4 pence. And the 2 French gendarmes who entered the restaurant that they were eating breakfast out of, this bed and breakfast, were dressed in period clothing from the 1890s. And then they went on their holiday in Nice, came back, and looked for that bed and breakfast, and there was nothing there. And when they asked people in Montélimar, was there something here? And they said, sure, there was a bed and breakfast there in the 1890s. So somehow the Gibneys and the Simpson time slipped back from like the 1980s to the 1890s, the 1970s to the 1890s. And when I investigated what happened in Montélimar, I found evidence in the open records on the internet that the largest release of radioactive plasma in the history of the French nuclear program had occurred right before that time slip that the Gibneys and the Simpsons experienced. But then when I publicized that on Facebook, guess what happened? That was scrubbed from the internet. Everybody said, I couldn't find what you said, Andy. And I said, well, I found it. And that was so frustrating about bringing this truth out. I kept on being attacked by any company or government department or agency that had any potential liability. They simply were scrubbing what I was finding. Like when I found that Ralph M. Parsons had bought the world's largest private yacht from Adnan Khashoggi, the Iranian merchant, in 1972 and changed it from its Farsi or Persian name as owned by Khashoggi to Pegasus 2, even though he had never owned a Pegasus 1. And that was right on the biography of Parsons on the Ralph M. Parsons Company website.
Yeah.
But then when I began sharing that on radio, guess what?
You took it down.
Parsons scrubbed it from Ralph M. Parsons' official biography as published on the internet. So I've been running against the tide of the suppression and destruction of history in my battle to tell true history. And as we have shown on this podcast, Aaron, I have won. So I think that's a hopeful story for all of us to remember.
Yeah. Well, you got all of us looking towards the future and also looking at what we achieved in the past and working to get that released. And we have to thank you millions of times, Andy, for coming forward and bringing this information that no one else has brought. This level of information.
Right. Now, the plasma confinement chamber, when you walked into that side of the chamber with the swirling opalescent radioactive plasma, you then experienced like a trapdoor sensation, and you were thrown around from hither to yon for about 30 seconds in an actual wormhole like the one depicted in What the Bleep Do We Know. In other words, it wasn't a straight shot like the ones created by the teleporter, or the next one we'll be discussing, the Stargate. It was sort of like a chaotic branching through the quantum plenum, a true wormhole, an irregular tunnel. And that's how I got my hat, both of my shoes, and one of my socks ripped off before I even got to Gettysburg, which is the principal opportunity I had to travel by a plasma confinement. And that was basically a reward for serving ably and well in Project Pegasus. And as my father said, making him proud by doing everything I was asked to do to the best of my ability, which was fairly frightening activity for a little kid.
Yeah.
And I did it. So I bore up, and I've also been telling my story just to show that, look, if a little kid can travel in time, and then one grown-up version of that little kid, a lawyer from Washington State, beat the entire U.S. Pentagon and Department of Defense in concealing its time travel secret, there is nothing in the universe that human beings cannot achieve.
That's right.
And that, again, has been one of the primary motivations of my truth campaign about time travel. Okay, so the next one after that, we go through that chaotic tunnel and then be spit out. I mentioned how I would smell ozone. And then I just had to kind of regroup and let the heat abate from my body and see how I was dressed. In the case of Gettysburg, I ripped off my other sock and threw it in the bushes and then walked into Gettysburg barefoot without even my hat on, and my teeth were chattering with cold by the time I got there. And that's why Mr. John Lawrence Burns helped me get more clothes, by which I then walked into the Lincoln Gettysburg Address site, where I was depicted in the left foreground of the so-called Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg. Josephine Cobb was the photo analyst at the Library of Congress who found the tiny little several pixels of Abraham Lincoln's face and head on the dais at the back of the image. But in the front of the image, I'm standing there with my left foot forward and my right foot to the right, kind of just so nobody will look at the weird hodgepodge of clothing that I'd been dressed in. I was trying to avoid detection. And it was in that position that I was captured for all the time in one of the photographs from the only 5% of Civil War photographs that were not used as panes of glass in greenhouses after the war, which ended up, most of them, 95% of them, fading and being destroyed by the sun after the Civil War. I'm sure to the distress and disappointment of the great Ken and Rick Burns for the making of their brilliant documentary, The Civil War. But my picture is featured right at the beginning of the chapter of the Gettysburg Address, as narrated by the great Sam Waterston. So when that came out in 1989, I was the only living American featured in Ken and Rick Burns' The Civil War, and that is a true claim. And I am proud of that. I am now a huge Ken and Rick Burns fan. I've seen every one of their incredible documentaries. I think he should win the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his great documentaries about our country's, illustrious past. So that was the plasma confinement chamber. I pretty much just had exposure to it with the Gettysburg Address, maybe a couple of other jumps, but nothing major. The next device was called the Stargate.
Wow.
The seventh device. Now, what the Stargate was a huge black anvil-shaped object with all kinds of different microelectric parts, motors, and solenoids, and just all manner of weird attachment. I'm not an engineer or a physicist, so I can't really explain what they were.
Okay.
There was a door-like aperture at the bottom of that sort of huge black anvil object. Now, the object itself was placed on the Olympic-sized basketball court at the Cerritos Cultural Center. That basketball court is now gone because it burned off in the 1980s. And as a result, you can see, almost as a subterranean amphitheater artifact, the amphitheater itself, at which Rumsfeld gave us that briefing in 1971 to tell us to not talk about the devices, and that the purpose of the teleporter was primarily military. It would enable the U.S. military to put troops precisely where they were needed on the battlefield. But in the 1970s, that basketball court hadn't burned off yet, and they placed the Stargate there. We would run up a ramp, hold our breath, jump through the aperture at the bottom of this black anvil-shaped device, and spend about 30 minutes getting between 1972 and 2045. So we had to kind of sip the oxygen off the top of our lungs, which I recently stated in an interview with Dr. Michael Sala, was really of no effort to me because I had been playing the alto saxophone for 3 years by then, and I could pretty much control my breathing, which you have to do when you play a woodwind instrument. And so after about 30 seconds, we would pop out on the plaza of this U.S. facility somewhere, I think in the Southwest, and we didn't find out it was 2045 until we were back in the present, and there were some individuals from the project in the future who were back in our time fixing the device so we could continue to jump to 2045. And we said, "What time are you guys from?" And they said, "You kids don't know that we're from the year 2045? They haven't told you that that's where you're going?"
Wow.
And we said, "Well, thank you very much, gentlemen." And we're kind of laughing that we've gotten it out of the technician so quickly.
Interesting.
But that was the Stargate. And I think that in the same way that remote viewing has been used in what I call the high side disinformation ploy to not reveal the contemporaneous use of chronovision with remote viewing, they also applied the term Stargate from this device to things like Project Stargate about remote viewing, and the movie Stargate, the TV show Stargate Atlantis,
Sure.
the 17th episode of the first season, which was called Project Pegasus, who again stir the pot and confuse people in thinking that actual technologies that have been developed are the product of science fiction.
Right.
Because that quantum XF device was called a Stargate. And they told us that. A Stargate was basically an elaborate Tesla teleport. But unlike the shop floor model, that elliptical shaped object that I described that we were using to get between New Jersey and New Mexico originally in real time,
right,
and then with an offset of several years, they had to make a huge device to get us to go all the way 73 years from 1972 to year 2045.
Wow. Did you have to run through it still, or?
We had to run up the ramp and then run through the double door-sized aperture. You know, like if you go through, let's say you go into Walmart and the whole door opens up
Sure.
on both sides. It was about that much width, like what then would have been like two telephone booth doors standing next to each other.
Okay.
About that much room. We had to run through that aperture, and we would be in a mortal tunnel for about 30 seconds on the path between 1972 and 2045.
30 seconds or 30
So
minutes?
that was the seventh device, the Stargate.
You say 30 seconds or 30 minutes?
I meant to say 30 seconds. Maybe I said 30 minutes, but we certainly weren't going to survive without breathing new breaths of oxygen in 30 minutes. I meant 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. 30 seconds.
30 seconds, yes.
Okay. That
Which
makes...
is not easy when you're a little kid. I mean, just try to hold your breath for 30 seconds as an adult. Not that easy. That's why they trained us to sip the remaining oxygen out of our lungs during those 30 seconds. And I was mentioning that as a saxophone player, that I took to very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, good. That's
so number
that's
8.
Interesting. Number
8 was a little microwave oven-shaped box that they were using to just place a telephone call, let's say, between New Mexico and Washington, D.C., and then they would open it up and there would be documents there. I think that was the original creation of what became what was known as the aeronautical repositioning chamber that we were using to get to Mars from 8 to 20 minutes when it would morph from a box into a cylinder-like contraption. In other words, it must have been a very similar technology. It was sort of a quantum reshaping of the time-space matrix itself somehow. How they did that, we have no idea. And when people say, oh, tell us about you guys teleporting to Mars, we don't know that we were teleporting to Mars. They never called the arc that we were using to get to Mars a teleporter. And it wasn't under Dr. Howard Agnew. It was under Howard Hughes. And in my case, it wasn't DARPA again. It was I was simply working for the Navy, involved in a multi-agency task force. Was it the DARPA CIA Project Pegasus, as Weber has claimed? No. Project Pegasus was a DARPA project, and I explained that from the very beginning. So again, I can't control what some publicists have done to my work that's not accurate. It's almost like the post office effect, in which A tells B something, and instead of hearing what A's saying, they invent a new B, and then they tell C, and so on, until what you've originally said is kind of dramatically mutilated into something you can't even recognize. Mm-hmm. Project Pegasus was a DARPA project. It was not a DARPA CIA project. Similarly, it was not a CIA project to get to Mars. There were some CIA personnel on it, like Courtney Hunt. Some of the engineers, like my late father, had reporting requirements to the CIA and really all branches of the U.S. military and intelligence community. But really, as Bernie Mendez has explained, Project Mars was a multi-agency, multi-department defense project. That's the truth about Project Mars. But Project Pegasus was a DARPA project, and I discussed those 5 motives for using kids during one of our last episodes. Mm-hmm. You know, as experimentees, mm-hmm. as necessities, as viewees, as trainees, and as sanees. So in the context of DARPA's Project Pegasus, we were necessities in terms of the use of the chronovisors, and we were experimentees in terms of the effects of all of these 8 modalities on children. And that is tonight's Quest for Truth.
Awesome. That really clears up a lot, Andy. Thank you so much for giving us this awesome detailed list of all of the modalities of quantum access. See, I'm learning. quantum access is what we're
Right.
talking about, folks.
Right.
Well, thank you so
Right.
much.
And I'd like to quote from Max Eastman's Desiderata tonight, if I might, to tonight's show.
Okay.
He says something like, there's a lot of brilliant things in that poem. It begins, go placidly amid the noise and haste. But he says something like, as far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with others. And I would urge everybody to remember that and practice that, because I feel that exopolitics, just as in an earlier generation of ufology, and really all areas of the paranormal, the parapolitical, and the parascientific have been damaged by just too much contumacious squabbling between individual researchers. I think we should strive as far as possible without surrender to be on good terms with others. And I think of that in terms of being Christic. It was Benjamin Franklin who said, I guess it was in Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar, imitate Jesus and Socrates. And I think that's what Franklin was mentioning. In other words, do not focus on the politics of conflict with others. That's not Christic. That's not Socratic. Rather, just remain calm, remain focused on what's important, and do your work and participate in what you have to sing within the symphony of souls without making accusations about others, without even asking about who one person may be affiliated with. I mean, in doing those, television shows originating in 6 countries and radio shows soon to be originating in 16 countries when I'm interviewed in the United Kingdom and lecturing all over the hemisphere, I haven't said, oh, do these people pass muster by me when I judge them and their work? I haven't done that. I've said, as far as possible, without surrender, can I be on good terms with these individuals? In other words, are they professional and trustworthy enough to just merit my performance on their TV show, their radio show, traveling to their country to be on their stage, etc. So I would urge everybody to just pull back and avoid what William Shakespeare called contumely, which is basically contumacious conflict with others. We are all fallible. We are all mortal before we go back to heaven and then go on to acquire a new body with the same spirit, but with everything we've learned from our existing lives to that point. And we are all headed for ascension. So as far as possible, without surrender, be on good terms with others. That doesn't mean we tolerate abuse or deception or intrigue that's been directed at us that's negative. We just don't make a theme of it. If it's happened to us, we remove ourselves from that situation. We don't make a career of continuing conflicted interaction with those participants. I mean, I've mentioned, for example, the condign betrayal that I've gotten from some of the people who featured me on television, but that was just to set the record straight about how my true experiences and my effort to achieve true history had been attacked in an unfair way. And after making those observations, I just moved on and I don't talk about those people anymore. Mm-hmm. And I just want everybody to know that that will remain my policy, because at the end of the day and at the end of this life, my goal is to be Christic, not to somehow do anything but compete with my own potential, not anybody else's. And that's true of all of us. We're just competing against our own potential. We can either step up and expand our potential, or we can fall back and not achieve it. But nothing is gained by focusing on interpersonal conflicts with others for whatever reason. And That's happened again in exopolitics, and I disfavor that approach. I think that everybody who's prominent in the field can sit back and be proud for what they've accomplished in their lives. We have some very illustrious individuals in our field. There's no need for any conflict in the field.
Yes, unity.
We all have access to our work, our books, our articles, our website, our Facebook groups, TV shows, radio shows, documentary films, podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
We really are living in an incredibly great era for bringing information to others. And let's just celebrate that and focus on our work doing that.
Yes. Beautiful. Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Andy. We're looking forward to the next one already. Thank you so much. And we're also enjoying your interviews with Dr. Michael Sala. So thanks for doing those as well.
Right. And I'm also doing periodic appearances with Gary Anderson on Night Dreams Talk Radio. I'll be doing a performance on August 16th with Augie Nost from Arizona. So I'm really still doing, just in the last several days, I scheduled 7 appearances.
Wow.
So I also want everybody to know that I'm not playing favorites. I've done 500 radio shows because I've embraced all of those who wish to produce a show with me and get this information out. I haven't been beholden to any major or minor figure in any social science field, whether it's ufology, exopolitics, time travel, Mars, or what have you. And along the way, I essentially now rival the term Philadelphia experiment and Al Bielek on the histogram on like Google and YouTube. Mm-hmm. And the Mars Anomaly Research Society has grown from 2 individuals to 13,500 and is indisputably the leading Mars anomaly group in the world. I'm very proud of that. Mm-hmm. That's available to all of us. But I am not beholden to any figure, for example, in exopolitics, and I am proud that the 3 major publishers in that field, namely Weber, Sala, and Caston, have all over time come to affirm what has been the truth, which is I've been telling the truth from the beginning, mm-hmm. working not for the deep state, but for myself,
right,
and for the truth. And my goal has been true history, and as I've often said, we shall know the truth, and it shall set us free.
It certainly shall. And I want to give you just one of the many compliments you received tonight here from T. Wilson. Andy, you are a hero. Thank you so much. And that's sentiment.
Well, thank you, T. It's good to hear from you again.
And we'll see you next time, and we'll see you out on the interweb. And we're so happy you're back. Spread the word, folks. Andy is back, and the truth is coming out. So thank you so much, Andy.
You got it, Aaron. Have a great night.
You too. Bye-bye.